Hello viewers and my dear students, this is Dr. Dipankar Parvi, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Hijli College, Kharagpur, West Bengal, welcoming all of you in my video lecture that I am going to deliver and upload in my YouTube channel. Please subscribe my channel, and if you found it helpful, then please like it and give your necessary comments and suggestions on the comment box. So this is the second part of my previous lecture, the second part of Shelley episode, P.B. Shelley's introduction, P.B. Shelley's lifetime, and P.B. Shelley's poetical works and his main characteristics of Romantic era of British literature have already been dealt with in the last video lecture, and this lecture I want to dedicate entirely on the poem Ozymandias, which has been included into our Vidyasagar University's undergraduate curriculum. So let us begin directly with the poem Ozymandias. As we have already discussed the timeline of P.B. Shelley and his poetical career in my previous lecture, but one thing I need specially to mention here to remind you that this particular poem was written in December 1817 and published in January 1818 by P.B. Shelley, but it has got a very interesting information regarding the writing of that particular poem. So this particular poem has been written by another poet who is known as Horace Smith. Horace Smith and P.B. Shelley both were in a competition to write a particular poem with a particular name. The name is Ozymandias. The theme will be the same, and the subject matter will be the same, but the representation of their of the poems by these two respective poets will be different. So this particular poem with the same name was published by P.B. Shelley in 1818, though it was written in December 1817, but Shelley published in January 1818 under the pseudonym Glyceratus, and it was published in the Examiner. Examiner is a periodical, and this same title, the same poem with the same theme, was also published by Horace Smith, and he published it in February 1818, just 1 month later. So it was a kind of competition, and to write a particular poem with the same name, with the same theme, by two different poets. So this is a very interesting information regarding this particular sonnet, Ozymandias. So before I explain the poem, I would like to read a few lines of the poem first. The poem is a 14-line poem, and it has been recognized as a sonnet, although there were several controversies whether this is the apex of sonnet writing or not. That I will come later on in my discussion in today's video lecture. But before analyzing word by word, line by line, I would like to read the poem first. Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless lakes of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal lake, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So this is the main construct of the poem that was written by P.P. Shelley. So let us come to the discussion and analysis from the very first line. So Ozymandias is the Greek form of an Egyptian name. That Ozymandias is supposed to have ruled Egypt and conquered a few Asiatic countries about 4,000 years ago. So it is a Greek name of Rames II. Rames II, it is the Greek name, and this particular pharaoh, the pharaoh is known as the ruler, the king of Egypt. So pharaoh who was born in 1304 and died in 1237 BC before Christ, and with whom Moses fought during the Exodus. So this sonnet, which was written in December 1817, as I have told, and was published in 1818, is in contrast with the poem of another poet. I told the name right now, that is Horace Smith, who was also a friend of Shelley. So at that time, Ramesh too is known for his fierce wars with the Libyans and his extensive building projects, as well as the many colossal statues of his thoughts of his own he established throughout Egypt. And Shelley chooses this particular Egyptian culture because it far antedates Greek or Italian culture. So Shelley had a pasha for these antedate cultures of Egyptian or Greek or Italian culture, but as Egyptian culture is much more older than the Greek culture or the Italian culture. So the very first title, or the meaning of the title is represented by a Greek form of the Egyptian name, that is Ozymandias, who ruled particular country Egypt, and who conquered almost several countries, Asiatic countries, 4,000 years ago. So the poem starts with a traveler's vision, with a traveler's encounter, and the very first line shows that I met a traveler from an antique land, from an antique land. So I met a traveler. I met a traveler from an antique land. What is that antique land? The antique land is the Egypt, or it is the suggestion of time travel, where the traveler across the time meets the poet. So it is a suggestive of the time, a time travel by the traveler. So antique land is the old country, that is Egypt. Egyptian civilization can be traced to prehistoric times. So this Egyptian culture, this Egyptian civilization has been referred here by this particular phrase, the antique land. So I met a traveler from an antique land who said, it is his version, the traveler's version, two vast trunkless lakes of stone stand in the desert. Two vast and trunkless lakes of stones. So vast means huge, and 2 is the number. So two vast trunkless lakes of stone. So a statue which is generally made of stone is being referred here, and stand in the desert. So stand in the desert means it was established in a vast desert full of sand. So it is within the barren, uncultivated land, which is full of only sand and sand and sand. There is no vegetation, there is no water, nothing exists in a particular desert. So what we see, that two vast and trunkless lakes of stone were lying in the vast unarid, absolutely barren, full of sand land, and it is desert. So near them, the third line, near them on the sand half sunk a shattered visage lies. So near that particular trunk or trunkless legs that were there on the sand, there were another portion of that broken statue that was half sunk. Half sunk means that was half buried in the sand. Half buried in the sand, a shattered visage lies. So if visage, what is the meaning of visage? Visage is the countenance, the face. Visage is the face, the countenance that we generally know. So it is a shattered visage. So shattered visage, why? Because it is broken face, the statue is broken, and the particular visage, the face that was lying on the sand. So shattered visage, and it has got also another meaning, that specially with reference to the proportion of the form. In another sense, the whole character of a person is being reflected in the face or in the visage. So the Pharaoh Ozymandias' character is being reflected, or we can see through the visage some of the characteristic features of that particular emperor, the king. So half sunk, a shattered visage lies. It was lying on the sand, whose frown and wrinkled lip, whose frown, the visage, from the visage that was lying on the sand, we can see that the frown, that means the scowl, 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 or a kind of anger, and the wrinkled lip, the lip is wrinkled, that means the curved lip, and it is a sign of pride, it's a sign of hubris, it's a sign of utter it is a gesture of anger, as well as mixed with full of proudness, full of proud feeling. So from the wrinkled lip and the frown, we can read what might be the character of that particular emperor or that particular Pharaoh Ozymandias. So half sunk, its shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. Sneering, sneering means to curve the nose to show the contempt. So it is a kind of gesture that we generally do by wrinkle our nose, and we show a kind of contempt. So this kind of contempt was also visible on that particular visage that was lying on the sand of that desert. So the wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. So why the command is cold? What is the meaning of cold? So cold here is not something which has got to do with temperature. Cold is here heartless. So it has devoid of any sort of passions. It was devoid of any sort of warmthness. So it is cold, heartless command, and command means we all know that it is authority. So the visage shows clearly that Ozymandias was a very authoritative person, authoritative king. So that authority comes with a kind of admixture of heartlessness, or a kind of passionlessness, and that was associated with his command, each and every command. So wrinkled lip, frown, wrinkled lip, and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor will those passions rate. So what is the meaning of this line? These gestures, these four things that have been mentioned in line number 4, 5, what are they? They are the frown, that means the scowl, which I have mentioned; wrinkled lips, that is the gesture of anger mixed with hubris and proud; and the sneer, that means the showing of contempt by wrinkling our nose; and the cold command, that is a kind of heartless authority. These are the four characteristics that were found if we look very minutely and carefully to the broken visage that was lying on the sand of that desert. So before that, what the poet suggests here, that tell that its sculptor will those passions read. So these are the passions, and these passions were well read. That means the sculptor could understand the passions of pride, passions of contempt, passions of all these four gestures, and the statue maker, who will make the statue, he has already gone through the emotions, the passions of that particular person, Ozymandias, before making the statue. So a sculptor who is supposed to make the statue out of a stone piece has to go through all sorts of emotions that were embedded in the face or embedded in the countenance. So a sculptor has to read all these emotions first to make out a statue, make out a really fruitful statue, a momentum, so a monument that has to be established before cutting the or engraving the stone one step by another. So these are the things that the sculptor has already read very minutely. And the next line, which yet survive, which yet survive means which has already outlived. That means the it is the time travel in the poem. That means it has outlived, it has passed the time, it has passed the ravages of time. So it has outlived the outlived and stamped on these lifeless things. So why it is lifeless? Because this particular statue is made out of stone. So stone is something which is inanimate object, and stone cannot have any kind of liveliness in it. So it is when a sculptor engraved the passions or tries to build a statue out of that piece of stone, it becomes or it remains a lifeless thing. So what is the plain meaning? That these passions have already outlived, these four passions that have already been encountered in the visage, they were outlived. That means they remained in the countenance that were lying on the sand. So outlived and stamped. Stamped means here it is engraved, stamped on these lifeless things, these stone made statue, that is called lifeless things. So we have come almost half of the poem. The next line, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. This is one of the very important line of this particular small poem. The hand that mocked them. So what is the meaning of the hand? The hand, what is the meaning of hand? Hand is not supposed to be the hand of a person. So hand here means the part for the whole. So in rhetoric we have read it symbolizes, it means that hand is not simply a hand. Hand is the person whose handiwork is the outcome of that particular statue, and who will build who will engrave those humanly emotions, those human passions, and transformed those passions into that particular piece of stone. So here hand is the hand of the sculptor. So a hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. This is the line. So hand that mocked them. So what is mocking? Mocking means such a ridiculing. So the hand of the artist who shows his dislike for the king's pride. So the person, the sculptor, the sculptor maker who has already read the passions very carefully on the visage or the countenance of the emperor or the king, but he really dislikes all those passions before making the statue. That is why it is said that the hand that mocked them. So the hand means the sculptor who has mocked, who has rebuffed, who has ridiculed all these humanly arrogant passions. Those were not supposed to remain in a very lively person, in a very layman, in a very jocund kind of person, merry-making person. So it shows that an emperor, a king, must have been the product of proudfulness, the must have been the product of hubris, must have been the product of his own egotism. So these with this stature, with this kind of hierarchy, a king or an emperor is supposed to reflect all kinds of negative passions, negative characteristics, and these negative characteristics were being totally reflected on the visage of his own face. So that these passions, these negative qualities have well been read by the sculptor, and he really disliked this before making the statue. So this is the simple meaning, that the sculptor has mocked the king's this pride, king's arrogant nature, all sorts of things. So the next portion, the heart that fed. So the heart that fed means the heart of the king, heart of the king of the Ozymandias, the heart of the king of Ozymandias, who harbored this kind of passions of pride. So a person, when he goes upstairs, when he goes high above, leaving his fellow persons, laymen behind, so he suppose that he has gone to the height of something where he has achieved something unique, and that uniqueness will obviously bring into his mind a kind of complacency, a kind of sensation of proud feeling, a kind of hubris, a kind of apathy towards his fellow followers. So with all these negative capabilities, with all these negative emotions, passions, were buried, were harbored in the heart of the king of Ozymandias. So this line is very important. It on the very first part of the line, the hand, that means the sculptor's hand, mocked this kind of passions that he read well in the visage of Ozymandias. And the last portion of the line says that these particular negative passions were harbored in the heart of the very arrogant emperor, arrogant king Ozymandias. So the heart that fed, we can hear here, fed means here it is nourished, it is being harbored. So we come to the next line, and on the pedestal these words appear. And pedestal is a very common thing. Pedestal is the platform on which the statue is built. So pedestal is very important, and in that pedestal there were a kind of space and some quotation, some lines were engraved, lines were written there. And what were those two lines? And on the pedestal these words appear. What were the words? Next in quotation, my name is Ozymandias, king of kings. My name is Ozymandias. So he is proudly vociferating, loudly claiming his name, that my name is Ozymandias. No other man is named as Ozymandias. It is me, it is my name. And who am I? The last portion of the line, comma, king of kings. That means I am the king, and not only the king, I am the king of kings. That means I am the king of all other kings. That means I am the emperor, I am the proud emperor of, and I am the best among all other kings. So my attitude is totally different, my way of thinking is totally different from others. So king of kings means emperor. So next line goes, look on my works, look on my works, ye mighty and despair. So look on my works. The Ozymandias is proudly confessing that look on my works. That means whatever deed I have done into my life as a king, or as an emperor, look at that vastness of that work. So whatever little I have done, there is a kind of proud feeling, or it might be a very vast emperor, it might be a very vast land that Ozymandias has occupied, but this particular deed, he really confessed that look on my works. See, visit this my work. And ye mighty, mighty with capital A, mighty has been personified. Ye mighty and despair. That means mighty means great people. Great people, and despair means a feeling of disappointment, a feeling of feeling of sadness, feeling of melancholy. So despair, if, who is feeling despair? Because you will not be able to equal me. The poet, the Ozymandias, the king, the emperor, is suggesting that you can see the vastness of my work, you can see the hugeness of my emperor, but in no way you can compare that vastness with your achievement. So your achievement is very little, your achievement is very less, and my achievement is much more than that. So my name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty and despair. So after comparing your deed with my deed, you will feel a kind of contempt, you will feel a kind of disappointment in your heart. So you will feel a kind of despair and melancholic feeling in your heart, because you cannot able to equal my work with your achievement. So this is the essence of the line, the height of proud feeling, the acme of hubris is being reflected in these two lines that were inscribed on the pedestal of the statue. Now we come to the last three lines of the poem. Nothing beside remains. So nothing beside remains means except the broken statue, nothing at all remains. So the king, the pharaoh, the emperor Ozymandias had already died long ago. So Ozymandias had died long ago, and there is no trace of his mortality. Man is mortal, so obviously the king will also die. But what is the achievement? His achievement is that he has already established several statues throughout Egypt, and that is the achievement. People will come and see, oh, there were such a big emperor, there was such a vast emperor, and with so many vast reign, and he was really brave, and he did something really good for humanity. All these things, people will come in future, and people will see after the statues that were established in his name. So nothing beside remains. Here also we see that after several thousand years, that particular statue were broken, ruined, dilapidated, and it fell on the ground, it fell on the sand, it was buried on the sand rather. So buried has got a symbol, buried, that means it is almost engraved. So it is almost on the declining phase, it is almost on the waning phase. So nothing beside remains. There is nothing to be carried on, nothing to be kept with us. So one day we will die, so one day we have to leave this world, and while leaving this world we will not carry our proud feeling, we will not carry our achievements, we will not carry our emotions, sentiments with us. We will left all these things on this earth. So whatever achievement or whatever good thing we will achieve, we have to achieve into our earthly existence, and we cannot carry all these things to the next world that we are supposed to go after our demise. So nothing beside remains. So here it is very ironical that the pharaoh, the emperor, the king had died, and after his death there is nothing, only the statue, and that also were destructed, that also were destroyed, that also were ruined with the passing of the time. So the very essential theme, Shakespearean theme, that we have found in many of Shakespeare's sonnets, the ravages of time, is also being reflected here in this sonnet also. So Shelley had gone almost close to Shakespearean theme of ravages of time and that is being reflected here in this particular line. Nothing beside remains. That means time will take almost all the paraphernalia of human being with the passing of it. So we cannot even judge ourselves, we cannot even compromise with the things that we achieved in this earthly existence. So nothing beside remains means here it is very simple, that except this broken statue, all these kind of proud feelings, the cold command, the sneering, and the wrinkled leaves, frown, these things are all evaporated. These things didn't remain there. So round the decay of that colossal rake, round the decay of that colossal rake, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. The last three lines were very ironical in nature. Round the decay. So round the decay means because it is round the decay. So round the decay is generally is the decay, that is the ruin or the destruction with the passing of the time. Round the decay of the colossal rake. So what is colossal? Colossal means huge, absolutely huge. That means a person whose height is 6 feet or 5 feet something, but the statue that that is being constructed, that is being established, is something which is faster than the existing height of a particular person, the real height of a particular person. So it is something colossal. That means it is huge and it is vast. So that colossal rake means such a broken, that means that is being ruined, that is being destroyed. Or so that particular colossal statue that was constructed to embody all the proud feelings and the essential characteristics and paraphernalia of the King Ozymandias were also ravaged during the passing of these years, these 100 years or 1,000 years. So there remains nothing, only the wreck of that big statue, the vast statue. So the wreck remains there, not the person, nothing. Even that wreck will also perish one day, and it will mix with the element of sand in the desert. So the last portion of the penultimate line, boundless and bare. So boundless and bare. So boundless means it is unending. So it has got a kind of comparison with the vastness of the emperor, that King Ozymandias had already established, already built, and the vastness of the desert. The desert is really vast, and the desert has gone from one end to another end, and that vastness is being seen clearly because there were no liveliness, there were no vegetation, only sand and sand and sand, and there were no. So the colossal statue also refers to the statue of Apollo that was constructed, or that was there in the main entrance of the Harbour of Rhodes, and that might have been one of the allusions that is being inscribed here in this line. And rake, that I have already told, that is broken statue, totally dilapidated, ruined statue. And the boundless means it is unending, and it has been compared with the unending vast land of the desert land. The desert is from one place to another, which is full of sand, and there were no water bodies, there were no vegetations, there were nothing at all, only sand and sand and sand. So this vastness is being compared with the vastness of the empire that has been constructed, that has been acquired, that has been conquered by King Ozymandias, Emperor Ozymandias. So and it is bare, and the bare word is very important, boundless and bare. This statue is now so the statue has fallen on the sand, and it is not at all covered, it is not at all respected. It was lying on the sand as a very bare piece of stone. So there remains no significance, there remains no attachment with that emotion with which the statue was built at a time. So bare means without having any plants, without having any cover. So it is bare, totally bare. It is exposed to the nature, it is exposed to the sun, it is exposed to the air, it is exposed to the natural elements of the earth. So now we have to come in this art, we have to achieve our greatness, we have to do some great deeds, and we will really keep ourselves happy with that achievement, and that achievement we will never carry into the next world. So we have to expose all these things here, we have to leave all these things here, so we will go barehanded. So this is another meaning, the boundless and bare. And the last line is very important: the lone and level sands stretch far away. The lone means here lonely, without having any living being. As I have already told, it is a desert land. So desert is supposed to be a very lonely land, where there will be no water bodies, there will be no vegetations, no trees, plants, anything. There will be no trace of liveliness there. So it is loneliness, and that loneliness has a very ironical bearing with the loneliness of the broken statue that were lying on the very desert, lying on the sand. So one day this particular king was followed by several followers, were eulogized by general public, general common layman, and that kind of appreciation was not supposed to be here with the statue. The statue is lying bare, and statue is fallen, broken on the sand, and it is lying. And lying is also has got a one very significant symbol. So when a person is alive, he is supposed to be in a position of vertical, position. He remains in a vertical position. That means what we call in straight position. But when a person dies, he cannot remain in a vertical position, he has to be in the horizontal position. So horizontal with the earth. So deathliness is a symbol of horizontality. We found this particular image also in T.S. Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in the beginning, very beginning of the poem. Here I can also suggest that particular reference, that the lone and level sands, this particular word level means here the position of horizontality, the horizontal position. It is not vertical. So it is dead. The emperor is also dead. The construct of the replica, the statue, is also dead. So there is no trace of that arrogance, no trace of that proud feeling, the hubris, that that kind of heartless authority, command, sneer, frown, all emotions, all paraphernalias, whether it is negative or positive, they all lie buried with the death of that particular king, or the death of that particular statue, the ruin of the particular statue. So it is the symbol of the level. The lone and level sands stretch far away, and it has also a very simple meaning, that the desert has got a kind of level sands. The desert is vast, full of vast land, full of sands. So it is lonely without having any living being, and stretch means here extended. The desert is extended to a very vast area. So that very vast desert has been compared with the vastness of the empire, the vastness of the empire that the emperor Ozymandias once achieved. So this is the word by word analysis and line by line analysis of this particular sonnet of P.B. Shelley, and I hope you will gain benefit out of this explanation. And there might be some sort of other explanations also, but this is the basic thing which I need to tell to you for your clear understanding. So if we want to conclude the poem, to sum up the poem, so what did we see? That the statue of the king Ozymandias wears a kind of expression of hauteur, contempt, a kind of arrogance and cruel confidence, even to this day, because the statue also reflects those negative paraphernalias. So its face wears a kind of frown and a sneer, and its upper lip is curled as if in scorn. Thus, the statue bears a lifelike resemblance of the Emperor Ozymandias, and it depicts a distinct kind of his personality. It is evidently the work of the skillful hand of that particular sculptor who could impart such lifelike resemblance to a mere piece of stone, and could capture the short-lived, that is ephemeral, transient feelings on such a lifeless and hard substance as a stone. So this is the main credit. The credit goes to the sculptor who has captured this short-lived, this ephemeral kind of feelings in the countenance, and these feelings were embedded or transformed into that lifeless piece of the stone. The man who made the statue and made these feelings immortal has been dead these 4,000 years. The king who resembled the statue bears, and on whose face these feelings were vividly captured, played for a while, and is also dead. So the sculptor is also dead. The person whose statue is being made by the sculptor, the person is the emperor, is also dead. But these feelings still play upon the face of the statue as a living testimony of the skill of the artist. So they remain. They can remind us. They can remind us that through the heart from which these feelings may arise on the heart stone may also pass away. These feelings have been permanent on the stone. So the what we can say, that art imparts permanence. What we have seen in our previous poem, Ode to a Nightingale, that the art, the song of the nightingale is immortal, although the nightingale is mortal. Similarly, here also the king, the emperor Ozymandias is dead. Ozymandias is mortal. The sculptor who has made this particular statue, he is also dead. But these particular emotions that were being embedded, that were being engraved on that piece of stone, were the artistic work, and these artistic works were got a kind of permanence and continuity, and that with which the actual life it is very transient and ephemeral. We cannot remain a skeptic, or we cannot remain happy, we cannot remain sad forever. So these are all ephemeral emotions, and these emotions were really captured by that particular sculptor in a very minute moment before engraving the statue, before making the statue. So the last portion, from line number 9 to line number 14, we can sum up that these remaining lines of the poem bring to us two sides, two ideas, with which a powerful and emphatic contrast to the idea is being expressed in these first 8 lines. And what were they? The boastful lines inscribed under the statue, which claims the greatness and glory of Ozymandias, and these words are powerfully contrasted with the actual condition in which we find the statue today. That I have explained, that we are the dilapidated statue, the ruined statue, with which this is the actual condition of the statue. We have found lying on the desert, lying on the sand of the desert, and the lines that were written on the pedestal is the actual condition with which the statue was made. With that words keeping in mind, the statue was made. So for where the king Ozymandias now, who has ever heard of him, who will hear Ozymandias, and the vastness and the boundless desert which surrounds the ruin of the statue, this is contrasted with the smallness of the colossal statue. So however we think that we are great, we think that we are proud, we have done several things in our life, we have achieved several things in our life, our achievement is very less, our achievement is tiny, our achievement is very small in comparison to the vastness of the nature, in comparison to the vastness of this world. So what is the statue as being compared with this great desert? Thus these 6 lines complete the poem, and through this powerful contrast, contrast is thus the vanity of human pomp and greatness. So human pomp and greatness, whatever we show in this art, is nothing but a vanity, and the boastfulness of man, the proud feeling, the hauteur, the arrogance of man, and his littleness in contrast to the vastness of nature. So a desert is embodied here as a vastness of the nature, and that vastness of nature is being compared or contrasted with the smallness and tininess of our achievement in this art. So this is the summing up of the entire sonnet into separate parts, line number 1 to 8 and 9 to 14. And now I would say something which is very in a nutshell, the critical summary of this particular poem. A traveler who relates how in a vast boundless desert this stands the statue of King Ozymandias. Only its legs stand, and its broken trunk lies half buried in the sand. The inscription on the pedestal shows that Ozymandias thought himself mightier than God, and the ruins of the dead king's statue offers a strong contrast to the vastness of the desert and the empty boast inscribed on it. So there stands an eloquent commentary on the vanity of human greatness. So whatever we achieve in our lifetime, in our through our deeds, whatever good or whatever bad we do in our lifetime is nothing but a kind of vanity, a kind of arrogance. So this is the summary. And if we talk about the relevance of sonnet, or how this sonnet, this is the critics have told that this is not the acme of sonnet writing. So Byron and Shelley both wrote several sonnets, but in comparison to Byron's sonnet, this sonnet is not so up to the mark as being told by a very important critic, William Sharp. William Sharp told that Shelley wrote even fewer sonnets from Byron, but whatever few that Byron wrote, he wrote well over than Shelley. So his imaginative and beautiful poem in these 14 lines is so divergent from all accepted rules that it can hardly be styled as a sonnet. So no writer nowadays could venture to print a sonnet with this kind of rhyming pattern: stone, frown, appear, despair. This and the rhyme scheme is also a little bit variant. It is written, this particular sonnet Ozymandias is written in A B A C D C E D E F E F. So this kind of rhyme scheme with iambic meter in 10 syllable each line is not generally found in a sonnet. So this is something devoid of the Petrarchan or Shakespearean or Miltonic sonnet. So Shelley had really left this sonnet writing into a new era or new realm. He didn't follow the basic pattern of sonnet writing. So now let us come to the very end of the discussion of the poem, that is the theme, the presentation of the theme. And so in spite of the technical drawbacks that we have mentioned right now as a sonnet, however it may be lacking as a sonnet, so Ozymandias is universally accepted as one of the finest poems of Shelley. Because why? Because of its theme. The theme is, I have already mentioned, the theme is the ravages of time, and this particular theme is the favorite theme of Shakespeare, and many of his sonnets, in Shakespeare's sonnet we have found this particular playing of time, the role of time, ravages of time. So that particular theme is also being presented here in by Shelley in this particular sonnet Ozymandias. So this is the theme. To make that, he wants to say more convincingly, he maintains and detached one throughout the poem, except the first 10 words where Shelley seemed to imply that he will merely report and not interpret the entire poem in fashionable after a traveller's tale. Shelley has employed this device deliberately because he knows that moral preached indirectly or through narrator or events by supposed eyewitness can be much more quicker to get home into the plain direct sermon. So this clear visual image at the beginning of the tale are meant to suggest that traveler's reliability and quick observation of relevant details, and the crux of the poem, that is the acme of the poem, the inscription, seem more convincing because it seems to come from a very reliable impartial traveler. And this explains why the last three lines of the poem, which contains the irony of the inscription as well as the theme, seem to so poignant, convincing and clear to anyone who reads the poem. So this is being referred by one very great critic of Shelley, and he has wrote one essay. The name of the critic is Desmond King Hill. Desmond King Hill says that no one who was asked to select a typical poem of Shelley's would be choice is the Ozymandias. So intuitively one feels the poem is completely untypical, and it is not difficult to say why. First, there is the subject. Shelley usually wrote things about which is very near to his heart, which is very dear to his heart, the skylar, cloud, etc. So here in this poem we see that he has gone away from his near and dear heart object to a object which is very remote, the Ozymandias, the statue. And then there is the tone, which partly because of the subject is passionless, objective and calm, instead of being passionate and subjective and excited in other poems. So last and perhaps most important, there is the aim. Shelley's habit was to aim high, something impossibly high, as we have seen in the case of Skylar. So it is the most rewarding type of poem which yields new layers of meaning at each rereading. This success was really complete. So in Ozymandias, however, he is content with a limited objective, a straightforward piece of irony, limited objective and straightforward piece of irony, and he succeeds completely. So I quote from this last few lines from the essay written by Desmond King Hill, and who has given the causes of distraction from his very heart and dear and near object to a very remote object like a statue of Ozymandias. So this is entirely an exhaustive study of this particular sonnet, and there will remain nothing except a varied interpretation by someone else. So I hope that you all have enjoyed my video lecture here today, because it analyzes minutely, it analyzes each and every word, each and every sentence, as well as images that lie buried in the poem, and the summary and the themes and the uniqueness of the poem. So it will remain helpful forever, and I think that my previous lecture, the introductory part of P.B. Shelley was also going to be of your help. So with this tone, with this note rather, I would like to conclude from here, and perhaps in my next video lecture I will be delivering you some other new poets or authors, and for the time being you please keep yourself keep confined within the four walls in this corona quarantine period, and study these lectures and read the materials that have been supplied to you. And if you think that you have any sort of queries, suggestions, questions, want to get kind of explanation from explanation of any word or meaning, so you can write freely in the comment box. And if you need some references, books as well to for further studies, then you can also consult me or have a query put in the comment box. So I thank you all for keeping my channel a really fruitful one. It is gaining popularity day by day, and this lecture will be also helpful to you and for your support and for your benevolence. So I thank all my viewers and all my students from here. I bid farewell. Thank you very much.